we are joined by IEP coach Lisa Baskin Wright. Lisa is a former high school math teacher from San Lorenzo High School and the Oakland chapter of Upward Bound. When she initially left the classroom, she supervised and mentored teachers getting their credentials through Mills College. Later, Lisa worked as a math specialist at a local high school supporting children who were struggling. Prior to this last year, Lisa spent 5 years as a mentor for the new K-12 teachers in multiple classrooms throughout Oakland. Her focus was on helping teachers get curious about themselves and the learners in the room. As a parent of a neurodivergent child, she has personal experience navigating the IEP process. Her work as a teacher and parent led her to a career as an IEP coach, where she has spent 2 years focusing on helping teams use neurodiversity-affirming approach to collaborate and create IEPs that truly meet the unique needs of each learner. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Lisa.
Hi, I just want to thank you all so much for coming tonight. And I just have to, this is such a wonderful surprise. I have to say hi to Judy and Jeff Kennedy, who are right next to me on the screen. My mom taught with Judy for a million years, and she's basically they're second parents to me, and I did not know they were coming. So I just have to share that excitement as part of my introduction, that there's all of you are really lovely people. There's some really special people in the room tonight that I didn't know were coming. So I'm going to share my screen, and you can give me a thumbs up or peruse if you want to let me know if you guys can all see. Oh, and of course I'm starting on the wrong, on the wrong slide because we did a test run. Okay, so welcome to an introduction to the IEP process and meaningful parent input. And so when I was approached to give this presentation, what was lifted up as kind of the areas to highlight were, what is an IEP? What is the process to get an IEP? How does this all work? And how do we as parents meaningfully participate in this process in ways that feel collaborative and keep the conversation going, and really help our learners? So with that, Bruce did a lovely welcome of me. I'll share a little bit more about myself. So I actually grew up in Piedmont and went to Piedmont schools K through 8, and then did my high school at Bishop O'Dowd High School. I got my teaching credential at Mills, and I taught at San Lorenzo High School for a few years before my son was born. And at that point, I began working with pre-service teachers who are getting their teaching credentials through Mills College. And then my family actually relocated up to Davis, California, which is where both my kids did their early elementary, and my son did his middle school in the Davis public schools. And that is where I worked as a math specialist. And then school for my daughter was a challenge. And a lot of that challenge informed why I do this work. And so I have a lot of experience sitting at a table where conversations weren't necessarily going the way we as parents hope that they go. And we ended up in legal processes that were not fun. And so I don't ever want anyone to have the experience that I had as a parent. And so we ended up relocating back down to the Bay Area. And I went back to Mills and Oakland Unified to work with new teachers. And very quickly, especially teachers of our younger learners, weren't quite sure how to advocate for their students and really wanted to meet the needs of their students, and were overwhelmed by the process. And so I found myself sort of stepping out of the lane a little bit of being just a teacher mentor in terms of building their teacher practice, but also helping these teachers and the families in their classrooms navigate the IEP process. And about 2 years ago, kind of formalized that work and went through some training to become an IEP coach. And it's just been such a privilege to do this work. So let's get started with how do we even kind of start this process in the first place? And so a request for an IEP starts with a written request to the school team. Usually that will include the school psychologist, the special education teacher. It might include an administrator. Well, you want to make a written request to that team to ask for this comprehensive assessment for your learner. And there are a number of different areas that school teams can assess. And on the screen, we have them listed. Sometimes folks think that IEPs are just for academics. That is not true. It is for, I'm not an attorney, so nothing that is said tonight is legal advice, but I can quote the IDEA. And, within the purposes section of the IDEA, the purpose of an IEP is to provide a FAPE, which is an acronym we might be familiar with, but for some, they're not familiar with it. FAPE stands for a free and appropriate public education. So it's our job, it's the district's job to provide a free and appropriate public education that meets the unique needs of your learner to prepare them for further education, employment, and independent living. So we're really thinking about the whole learner and how they're accessing both academics and social, emotional, their communities, the whole thing. And so once you've made this request, the school team has 15 days here in California to respond to you with either what's called a prior written notice, where they tell you in writing why they don't feel your learner needs to be assessed. And they have to include data and rationale for that. It can't just be, we don't see it. Or they provide a prior written notice that is an assessment plan, and they have any or all of these boxes checked with the name of the position of the person who will be conducting the testing. So academic achievement, it'll say special education teacher. Health, it'll say school nurse. Down the line, speech language pathologist, occupational therapist, school psychologist, etc. And so one of the things I like to lift up or talk about with this assessment plan is that for, in particular, autistic learners, it isn't terribly uncommon, kind of in the current landscape, for occupational therapy or that motor development piece to be left out of the assessment plan. And I name this because autism is a difference in that kind of sensory processing, motor planning, communication. It includes those sensory differences, those motor differences. So we want the lens of an occupational therapist. Even more rare is to have a physical therapist as part of that gross motor development piece. And so I lift it up because we really want to be capturing the whole learner. And so we want as many perspectives on that team as is possible. And so sometimes the academic achievement and the social, emotional, and the intellectual piece will be checked, and speech language and motor might not be. And I just want to lift it up as an important thing to make sure all the boxes are checked, so we're getting this really comprehensive snapshot. The next piece is assuming that the district moves forward with the assessment plan, you sign it, you give it back to the district. From the day that you submit that assessment plan, that signed assessment plan back to the district, they have 60 days to complete all of their assessments and hold an IEP meeting. And ahead of the meeting, and technically it is 10 days, again, I want to lift up that in practice, since COVID, what has been happening, and actually did happen today in an IEP meeting that I was sitting in, is that this notice of meeting is being given at the meeting. And it really should be 10 days ahead of time, because you as the family need to know who's coming and what is the purpose of the meeting. Is it an initial IEP? Is it an annual IEP? Is it amendment? Are we, you know, why are we here? Why are we gathering? And, you know, just an anecdotal share why this piece is so important for me is many years ago with my own child, I received a notice of meeting and it was given ahead of time within the appropriate time frame. Um, and there was a person listed that I didn't know, I didn't recognize. And I kind of did the deep dive and looked at all the different school sites on the websites, and I couldn't find this person. And I was a little naive at the time and didn't really think much of it. And it actually, unfortunately, was an ambush. And it was somebody from a private agency, and they hadn't disclosed that. And they had released my child's records to this person without our consent. And that person had shown to the meeting with like a full assessment report on a child they had never met. So I don't think that happens very often, but I do want to lift the importance of this notice of meeting, because in the last several years, it's been one of those things that has fallen a little bit off the backside, and we just get like a Zoom invitation or a Google Meet invitation, and that's not really capturing what we should be getting. So now we are looking at eligibility. And when we think about this, you know, there are 13 categories. Oftentimes it's referred to as 13 doors of eligibility. So there's autism, there's OHI, which stands for other health impairment, speech language impairment, specific learning disability, emotional disturbance, intellectual disability. I don't see multiple disabilities checked often in California. I see this more in other states, but it is an eligibility category, and it is a good capture for learners who have multiple, like a more complex learning profile. Traumatic brain injury, deaf blindness, deafness, hearing impairment, orthopedic impairment, and visual impairment, including blindness. So there are, the IEP process is kind of like an A to B to C to D kind of a process. So when the team has done all of their assessments and you've gotten your notice of meeting, and hopefully, I want to lift this up as well, your right to be an equal participant in the IEP process is federally protected. You are named as an equal member of that team. But there is no way that you can be an equal participant if you do not have access to the same information as everybody else. So it's really, really, really important that when you sign that assessment plan and say, yes, go ahead, you can assess my learner, that you let the team know that you are requesting draft copies of all their assessment reports. And if your child is found eligible, you want a draft copy of the IEP. And I highlight the word draft because there is a little bit of a clause in the Ed Code that says you have the right to those reports, but only if they're ready. So when you use the word draft, you're saying, I recognize this might change, but I need to have the capture of whatever you've captured 5 days ahead of time so that I can read it, read through it, provide my input, and be ready to have a really collaborative, productive meeting. So when you gather at the table, whether that's virtual or in person, the first thing they're going to capture is your personal information. And they just need to be able to capture your demographics, a way to get a hold of you, you know, all the things. I caught a little bit of an error on this slide, so I'm going to flip it and go out of order. The next piece is parent input and present levels. And in the second half of my presentation, I'm going to really dive deep into parent input. So I'm going to a little bit put a pin in it for now, because I'm going to come back to that in more detail in a few minutes. But what often happens is you enter this meeting, there's introductions, there's an agenda given, and then we kind of jump right into tell us a little bit about your learner's strengths. And so you then are sharing all you can about your child, and everybody can contribute what they know about your learner, and really sort of lift up the positive. And then the team is going to ask you what your concerns are. And while this is intended to be a meaningful way to capture this information, doing it during the meeting isn't as effective as providing that parent input ahead of time. So again, I'm going to jump to that in a few minutes, but that's what I'll say about it for now. Once that information is gathered, we move into present levels. So if assessments have been done, this is going to be when each assessor gives their report. Again, if they have given you this information ahead of time and you've had an opportunity to digest it, to provide some questions ahead of time, this part of the process can be a little bit sped up, because what happens when reports aren't shared ahead of time is it almost becomes reading hour, and folks will literally read their reports and the meetings just kind of go on and on and on. And when you've had it ahead of time and have had time to review, you can have a little bit more of the Cliff Notes version, which is a good thing, because then it leaves more room for robust discussion when we get to eligibility. One thing I really want to say about present levels is present levels drive everything. So goals are determined from those present levels, which include your parent input. When we create goals, there has to be baseline data. So if the present levels haven't really captured who your learner is, or there are pieces that are missing, or your input hasn't been taken into consideration, the whole rest of the plan is going to be going down the wrong path. So it's really important that not only is there sort of testing data that's included in the present levels, but that there's anecdotal data in there. They should be really robust, and there should be your input, teacher input, a real solid affirming capture of who your learner is. It is not uncommon when we are looking at testing, because the parameters of the standardized testing are fairly pathologizing and kind of deficits focused, that when we're trying to create a neurodiversity affirming IEP, we really want to be cognizant of how is my child being framed in this section. Are we seeing my learner through a more affirming, humanizing lens? Are we seeing their differences in communication, or their differences in sensory processing, or their differences in their motor planning? Are we seeing those as differences, or are we trying to map it against kind of neuronormative standards and seeing it through this deficits pathologizing view? And it's really hard, because the scope of the testing is that kind of neuronormative frame. And we want to make sure that's not the platform that we're taking the next step from. So we want to humanize the child. We want to recognize differences. We want to get curious about who your learner is. It's just a really, really important part of the IEP process. Once present levels have been established, and in an initial IEP meeting, we are now going to be at eligibility. And so we're going to go back to those 13 categories and say, does this learner meet the eligibility criteria as is outlined in the IDEA, which is the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act? Every category has its own criteria. And one thing that is kind of a confusion point sometimes for parents is their child will have a medical diagnosis of autism or ADHD, and the school will very potentially say to them, there's a difference between a medical diagnosis and school-based eligibility, and one doesn't determine the other. And while that is true, the threshold to meet the medical criterion within the DSM is higher than it is to meet the eligibility criteria. And I just want you aware that that pushback can exist, especially in kind of a higher masking learner. And so it's important, again, those present levels, that we're really humanizing this learner and understanding who they are and how they process the world around them. Once eligibility is established, and in California, there is space for 2 categories. You only need one. And while that one should be the best capture of your learner possible, the eligibility category does not drive services. So if you have a learner, say, for example, meets eligibility criteria under autism, but they also need support with writing, and maybe that's a mechanical reason, like maybe there's dysgraphia, motor planning difference that needs direct support. Perhaps it's those executive functioning skills and, initiating the ideas and organizing their thoughts and being able to put it all together. They do not need a second eligibility category of specific learning disability in order to get support for their differences in writing. And so as long as it's lifted up in the present levels and we've captured it in the present levels, the eligibility category technically doesn't have to match. When my daughter was younger, she was initially only found eligible, and I say only because that was kind of pushed at me, under speech language. And it never felt right to me that she couldn't get any other help, because there were all these other areas that she needed support in, but we were sort of constantly told, well, she's speech only, so she doesn't need, and that's just not, it's just not true. So I want to name that. But once that's established, we then start moving into goals. And so this is where this mapping from the present levels to goals, really, there's like a pipeline between the two. And so we are going to look at those present levels and say, okay, did we lift up differences in communication? Did we lift up differences in coping skills when a learner has big feelings and frustration, and they don't yet know how to deal with those big feelings? Or is there an academic need that has been noted, and we need to have a goal to support that? And so we want to really write goals in such a way where we're still really humanizing the learner. And so I actually just finished my very first course called a neurodiversity-affirming approach to IEPs. And the last module is all about neurodiversity-affirming goal writing. Some things I will say about goals. If possible, you really don't want more than 8 in an IEP. I have seen IEPs that have as little as 1. I don't think that's enough. And I actually reviewed an IEP last year that had 37, and they were from a state where the goals are written differently than they are here in California. Here in California, goals are typically written as like the goal is the goal, and then the short-term objectives underneath are that goal, but at a lower sort of target level. So if the overarching goal is that the learner will achieve this skill at 80%, the short-term objective is the exact same thing, except it'll say at 50%. And then at the second benchmark, it'll say at 60% and so on till we hit 80. In other states of the union, they're not written that way. They're written as kind of this broad stroke statement, and then there are benchmarks underneath that are super specific of what that overarching goal looks like. And so I had an IEP that was written that way, and there were 37 goals, and there were between 5 and 9 benchmarks under each goal. It was a behemoth. And understandably, the learner was struggling, and the team didn't know what to do because it was impossible to deliver that IEP with any kind of fidelity. And so one thing I want to lift up, especially for parents of younger learners that are really new to the IEP process, there's this dynamic that happens between like preschool teams and families that is coming from this really good caretaking place on the part of the school team. But it ends up with an IEP that's too massive. And that is, they know that these parents are coming in nervous. It's their child's first experience at school. And there's a tendency to write goals for absolutely everything. And then you end up with an IEP for a 3-year-old that has 17 goals. And that's just way, way, way too many. And so one thing that, again, another kind of misnomer about goals is that I think some parents think that if there isn't a goal for it, then the school team isn't going to help your child in whatever skill development that is. And that's not true. The IEP is the bare minimum that a school team has to do. And the goals that are in there are just the things that they're tracking data on and tracking progress. But absolutely, they are going to be helping your learner across the board and in all skill development. So 8 is kind of the magic number. You can go a little below, you can go a little above, but we really want to avoid the scenario of kind of over therapizing a child, having a child kind of be over pathologized where somebody's like literally chasing them around with a checklist and, you know, tally marks of every little thing that they do. We start to lose the humanity of the human being when we do that. The next piece is special factors. This is where things like assistive technology live. This is also where if you have a learner who is deaf or blind or physically disabled, has kind of a lower incidence disability and requires specialized support or like, what's the word I'm going for? Like specialized support, specialized tools, specialized equipment, it would live in the special factors section. The other thing that is lifted up in special factors is behavior. So within that section, there is a question about, you know, does your child's behavior impede their access to education, and or does their behavior impede the access of their peers to education? And this is where we do start to take kind of a sharp turn away from neurodiversity affirming practices, because behavior plans are, and I'm not going to spend too much time on it, and I could talk about this for a really long time, but behavior plans, what we're really kind of looking for is the function of behavior. So school teams will do what's called an FBA, which stands for functional behavioral analysis. And they are going to collect what's called ABC data. And that stands for antecedent, behavior, and consequence. And so they are going to be looking at kind of what happened right before, what was the behavior, what happened right after. And one thing that I really want to lift up is that none of us know the internal experience of another human being. And often what neurodivergent folks are experiencing is not able to be witnessed in the immediate environment. So while that might give us some information, it's shallow information and it's potentially presumptive information. And so I just want to kind of put it on your radar that if your learner has a behavior plan, you really want to look at it to see that kind of pathologizing language, to see, are they trying to get your child to kind of behave in neurotypical ways, and are they doing so using kind of external systems like token economies and sticker charts and those kinds of things that potentially are causing your child, to feel a sense of shame, to become really prompt dependent. There's lots of outcomes from that are not positive for the neurodivergent child. And so, within the scope of today's conversation, I can't get too in the weeds, but I wanted to name it. The next piece of an IEP is supplementary aids and services. Here in California, that is where accommodations and modifications live. And so an accommodation is something that changes how your learner accesses their education. So things like extra time or preferential seating or having a sensory tool or breaks. It can be kind of anything that doesn't actually change the curriculum itself. A modification changes the curriculum. And so one thing I lifted up in my course, and I do want to lift up here, is that for our non-speaking students, for our students who are in the earlier stages of language acquisition, it is not uncommon for teams to not presume competence. There's some presuming incompetence that happens, and these learners are often put into really restrictive environments with heavily modified curriculum. And while that is absolutely appropriate for some kids, we are trying to meet learners where they are. It goes back to present levels and really doing a holistic capture of who a child is, because non-speaking does not mean non-thinking. And being in the earlier stages of natural language acquisition or having motor planning differences that lead to a person whose body is in motion and they can't necessarily control those movements, that has nothing to do with intellectual capacity. And we sometimes put these learners in more restrictive environments. And what that does is it unintentionally predetermines their outcome, because when we don't provide the same access to education and we sort of make this determination for a really young learner, we're essentially guaranteeing that that student is going to be on a certificate path instead of a diploma track. And I don't think we have the right to do that with a 3-year-old or a 5-year-old. And so it's this balance of trying to hold space for who a learner is in a moment and recognizing sort of the gaps in the standardized testing and the assumptions that we're making in learners who demonstrate their knowledge and capacity in different ways. The next piece is that offer of FAPE. And I just started to touch on it a little bit, but once we've, gone through all of these parts of the IEP and we've got goals and we've got accommodations, the team is then going to ask the threshold question, well, what services and where does it make sense to support this learner so that they can make meaningful progress on these goals that we've just outlined? And so this part of the IEP tends to be more district driven, and it shouldn't be. You're still an equal member of the team. So one of the things I like to recommend to families is to request to observe what's called the full continuum of placements. So within special education, the full continuum of placements starts in the least restrictive environment, which is general education with no supports, and it goes all the way up to a residential program or home-based instruction. And there's all kinds of permutations in between. And so you as the parent can't meaningfully contribute to this part of the conversation if you have not seen the different options available. And so it's really important to make that request and put eyes on the different options so that you can then come to the table and say, gosh, I really thought that the self-contained classroom was going to be a great fit, but actually, I think general education with some supports is where my learner really will thrive, or the other way around. But you can't know if you haven't seen. And the last thing I want to touch on super fast is extended school year. This is typically talked about in the spring. There are actually 7 different criterion for a student to become eligible for extended school year. It's separate than eligibility for an IEP itself. School teams tend to focus on regression and recoupment, meaning after a break from school, how far has your learner regressed? And when they return, how long does it take them to recoup the skills they lost? But there are 5 other reasons why a learner could qualify for extended school year. And extended school year and summer school are not the same thing. Extended school year is services that exist outside of the regular school calendar. So it could be over the winter holiday. It could be over the spring break. It could be after school during the school year. So again, just to name that, and if there's more questions during the Q&A, happy to answer. But let's move on to parent input, and I'm going to take a quick sip of water before I keep going. And I'm noticing time, so I'm gonna do this in hopefully 10 minutes or less. So why is it important to provide a parent input statement? So the first thing is it really opens up those lines of communication and gives you as the parent the opportunity to share information that the team isn't otherwise going to know about your child. And it also sets this tone for collaboration. I am here to share information, to talk with you, to engage in this process in really meaningful ways, and I expect the same from you. It also lifts up what's important for you. So kind of going back to that idea of the team trying to caretake and over kind of therapize and create too many goals. This is your way to say, hey, these are the 3 areas or 4 areas I really need you to zero in for my particular learner. And the last piece is when we provide this input, it actually becomes actionable. So I'm going to go into the next slide, and you'll see down at the bottom that you want to ideally submit this at least a week ahead of the meeting for that actionable piece, because what we're hoping to do in part is to start a conversation behind the scenes of like, oh gosh, did you get Lisa and Aaron's parent input statement? They really want us to zero in on supporting self-advocacy for their child. And so we didn't create a goal for self-advocacy. We really need to look at that and create a goal so that we're supporting their child in the ways that are really important for her and for them. So the way that I structure a parent input statement, and there's no one right way to do it, but I always like to start with a snapshot of who is your child. That real capture, what is their temperament? What is their learning style? What brings them joy? What makes them tick? And this is a really great space to share kind of an anecdote or two that the team really wouldn't know. I've had students that, write their own cookbooks or, love to listen to podcasts, or, they love to run, but they are not part of the school's team. And so the team wouldn't know that because it's not part of what the student is demonstrating at school. The next piece, after we've sort of painted this beautiful capture of your child is moving into the areas where we would like goals to focus. And so for me, I always kind of start this section in my world. The neurodiversity affirming approach to IEP is the kind of 4 skills that I want learners to walk away with from their educational experience is a sense of autonomy, a sense of agency, self-regulation skills, and self-advocacy skills. To me, those are kind of the 4 pillars. And so I always include that as kind of my first sentence in the next paragraph after the capture of like, this is what I'm going for, guys. I really want my learner to develop this strong sense of self and be able to communicate what they need and who they are and their ideas and all of those things, and feel like they have the agency and the tools to be able to do so. And I want them to have the skills to be able to kind of stay in their bodies throughout different moments of their lives. When things are stressful, when things are hard, I want them to know that they can trust themselves and have the tools to help them cope. So I always kind of start there. And then I move into core curriculum. And core curriculum can be academic, it can be communication, it can be executive functioning. It doesn't have to be math, like a specific skill in math or a specific skill in reading or writing or spelling or whatever. One thing that is super, super important when we're trying to frame who our learners are and starting to talk about these areas that we want goals to focus is it is absolutely critical to capture how your child communicates. So I don't know how familiar everyone is with Gestalt language processing, but very quickly, there's essentially 2 ways that humans develop language. One is analytic language processing, which means that you learn a word and then you learn another word and you recognize that single words are units of meaning. And at some point you kind of string those words together and move to self-generated grammar. The other way is Gestalt language processing. And Gestalt language processors go from the whole, the chunk, the script, and break that down or mitigate that script. So they might have like, let's go to the park and it's time for dinner. And they might at some point move to, let's go eat dinner. And so they're kind of mixing and matching. They then break those down into single words. And it isn't until stage 3 of natural language acquisition where there's that single word level. And then in stage 4, they start to generate their own grammar. It's not uncommon for these learners to, when they're in stage 4, to have a lot of like pronoun and verb tense mistakes because they're kind of mixing and matching these different scripts and trying to figure it all out. And those errors are common. One thing I will say, I don't know how many of you are parents of autistic learners, but the vast majority of autistic people are Gestalt cognitive processors, hold apart thinkers, seeing the patterns in things and trying to fit that into their understanding of their world. And that informs how they process language. And so oftentimes in schools, the strategies that are employed, the tests that are given are really with analytic language processors in mind. So there's a bit of a mismatch. So really lifting up how your learner communicates is a huge piece to framing who they are and how to support their access. The next piece are foundational goals. This could be life skills. This could be motor skills, communication, self-advocacy, all of those things can fall in here as well. The next piece is sensory and executive functioning differences. One thing that's so important is to describe what engagement looks like for your learner and what dysregulation, stress, anxiety, overwhelm, what does that look like? because it doesn't look the same for every person, obviously. But a lot of times in schools, we're really looking at externalizing behaviors, and that's what kind of trips the wire for, oh, this learner needs help. But in the fight, flight, freeze, fawn, amygdala response, not everybody is a fight, flight. And so there are learners who are more internalizing in their response. And for those who are more externalizing in their response, there can be almost a criminalizing that happens of those kids. So it's so important to humanize who your child is by describing what these things look like and including strategies that really help them regulate, feel good about themselves, etc. And then the last piece, and I've got an example on this slide, is a vision statement. There is no one right way to write a vision statement. This one that I have on the screen, and I will read it because I know listening to somebody and reading at the same time is hard. Our ultimate hope is for our child to develop self-advocacy and self-regulation skills so they can get their needs met, coping strategies so they can manage their executive functioning and sensory processing differences while accessing their education, and strong foundational academic skills so they are prepared for this year and beyond. This is just an example. This is more of like the broad stroke. Sometimes families really want to lift up a particular skill or a particular hope for a given year. Sometimes that's academic. Sometimes, I mean, I've had parents say, I really want my child to have a meaningful connection with a peer. I really want my child to, you know, be able to advocate when they need to use the restroom by the end of the year. It can be super specific. It can be more broad stroke. It can be a mix of each. And then last but not least, and maybe I can talk about this later, but I'll just lift it up now, is I have a couple of different ways for families to be able to work with me. One of them is one-on-one coaching, which I have to be honest, my calendar is pretty full for the next couple of months. So that's probably not the best option in this moment, but I do work with families one-on-one. Folks that choose that option, they really kind of drive what that looks like. In some cases, it's the occasional, hey, Lisa, can we jump on a Zoom call and check in? And in other cases, it's much more high touch, and they have me join them virtually for meetings. You guys are local to me, so it is possible, depending on the timing, that I could go in person. A lot of that communication, drafting the parent input statement, reviewing the IEP, all of those things that can happen in that one-on-one space. Like I said, I just created this course. Today was actually the last day of my live cohort, but I am going to be selling it at a lower price point as a fully asynchronous 4-week module, or 4 module. You can do it however long it takes you. You could do it in one day. That's going to be for sale on my website probably in the next 2 weeks. And then I created a group coaching community because my one-on-one client caseload kind of went past my own personal capacity, and there's just one of me. I have a very small team that helps me with like tech stuff and sort of strategic planning, but they don't actually work with families. And I was just feeling so terrible having to tell people no. And so I created a community, and we meet once a week. It is such a lovely group of parents. They are so supportive of one another. It's a place to ask questions. We have a virtual platform where questions can be asked. There are some free resources within that community that I don't make available anywhere else. We have monthly guest speakers. It's a really, really sweet way to get some support, both from me, but also feel like you're in a community of other parents. Not that you are not already in this wonderful community. I'm so impressed how many people there are here tonight. And last but not least, I am pretty active on my Instagram page. My handle is at Lisa Baskin Wright. I try to put out information almost daily, sometimes twice a day, sometimes once a day, sometimes every other day, depending on kind of what's going on. But I do have a lot of kind of tips and ideas and resources, and that if you're on Instagram, that is a way to get a hold of me and get some free content, some free information. But that I'm at 7:53, so
Thank
I
you,
think we
Lisa.
should I'll stop sharing.
All right. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Wonderful. So one of the things that I want to do, I'm going to go through some of these questions, is I'd love for you to address sort of the difference between the 504 versus the IEP process. What are the benefits? What are the deficits? Just if you could briefly go over that, that'd be lovely.
Sure, absolutely. So really there are a few key differences between an IEP and a 504. And an IEP is special education. It's under the protections of the IDEA, and a 504 is through the Office of Civil Rights. It is a general education program. And so with a 504, it is accommodations. A learner can get counseling services, and you actually don't need either for counseling. Um, it is a legal document. There are protections in it. I don't think it has the same level of protections as an IEP. An IEP has procedural safeguards. If the minutes aren't being met, or there's something amiss happening, a service isn't being provided, you have those procedural safeguards to kind of protect you that don't exist in the same kinds of ways with a 504. 504s are really appropriate for some learners. One thing I will lift up is that they do require, especially for middle school age students and beyond, they do require the child to be a pretty solid self-advocate and be able to kind of know what their accommodations are, feel empowered to use those accommodations. It doesn't have the same kind of oversight. So it can be appropriate. I obviously don't know everybody's learners in the room. So it can be an appropriate thing, but it is considered general education, and IEP is special education. The process to get started can be somewhat similar. I'm asking for this assessment. I want us to get curious about my kid and what they might need. You do have a team. You can provide input to that team. So your parent input statement would maybe shift from sort of goal ideas to accommodation ideas. It could be really similar. But I think those are kind of the big differences. With an IEP, the child will be receiving, or they'll need to recognize that that learner needs direct instruction, whereas in a 504 that doesn't exist. It's just the accommodations.
Thank you. Okay, so our next question is, if you can describe what kinds of things would constitute a modification or change of curriculum. For example, is not requiring homework completion a modification or an accommodation?
I think it's an accommodation. You can have in an accommodate, or in the accommodation section, a reduction in homework and an elimination of homework, right? Like you can have it written in that the child can demonstrate their understanding in a different way. So that can even be true with test taking, right? Like if your child is better at describing their ideas by talking, then that can be an accommodation written in that they can do their exams verbally and not the paper pencil, or the exact opposite, right? Like if you've got a learner that expresses themselves better in writing, or they need assistive technology support in that way, and the presentation to get in front of the class is too much, like they don't have to. We can accommodate that. I have had it written into IEPs that an accommodation is that work is modified to demonstrate mastery. So if, the homework assignment or the classwork assignment is 20 problems, say in a math class, but to demonstrate that they understand the skill, they can demonstrate that in, 7 to 10 problems. That's fine. Where we're really looking at modification is when we're saying this is the grade level content, that we are covering in our general education classroom, and we're not providing that content to your learner. Like, we're using something totally different. And certain districts have like curriculums that they've adopted as their modified curriculum. So it is totally different than what kind of the general education population is getting. So I see homework or demonstrating knowledge or even sort of reducing to demonstrate mastery as an accommodation, but that's a great question.
Well, I have something related to that. So what if there are parents with disabilities? Can they request a modification or, any type of accommodations for the IEP process and IEP meetings?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So if you have a disability and, it's hard for you to, verbally communicate all of your ideas during a meeting, or you really require time to be able to read and process ahead of time. I have families that will literally like write out their own script, and they either read it or they email it to the team and say, I need to be able to collect my thoughts out of the moment, outside of the moment. And I want to be able to share and meaningfully participate, but this is how I need to do it. And I absolutely, and it's not uncommon, right? For parents of neurodivergent learners to be neurodivergent. That's a common thing. And so we should absolutely be accommodating. I tend to not like to be sort of the voice of the family at an IEP meeting, but I do have a handful of families where the parent is neurodivergent, and they literally, during the space of an IEP meeting, they just can't put their thoughts together. So they're texting me, and the team just kind of knows that I'm here sort of not acting as the voice of the parent, but sort of amplifying the voice of the parent. And I think that's totally fine. But yeah, absolutely, accommodations should be made for parents.
Fantastic. So when you have a 504 plan, should you also submit a parent input statement for that?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's really, really important for you to sort of step into your space as a meaningful and equal participant in this process. Whether it's a 504 or an IEP, the only consistent members of that team are you and your child. Everybody else is going to change. And so whether that's because they leave the school, or you have a school change, or your child graduates out, or whatever it may be, you are the only consistent members of that team. So your voices, and I would say your child's voice even more, are the most important voices at the table. So yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. Okay, as far as processing styles go, Gestalt versus other style, is there a language processing test that can be conducted to determine what type of learner you have?
Sure, that's a great question too. So typically the standardized type testing is really designed with that analytic language processor in mind. And this is true with cognitive testing as well. It kind of requires this, I ask you a question, you respond. And even for our non-speaking learners, it has that component to it. And if that learner has motor planning differences or apraxia, and they don't have the same kind of control over their motor movements, so they can't point in the same kind of way, right? There's going to be this assumption that there's a lack of skill, and that's not a safe assumption. So the best way to really capture a Gestalt language processor's sort of where they are in the stages of natural language acquisition for a child who is speaking is to do an utterance sample, to do a language sample, and to have somebody who is trained in the stages of natural language acquisition. And not everybody can see the chat, can they? If you follow me on Instagram, I tend to share a lot of content from Meaningful Speech. Alex Zakos is a speech language pathologist out of, I think she's in Illinois, somewhere in the middle, who got really, really interested in this. She's been a speech language pathologist for almost 20 years and worked with a lot of autistic learners, and really felt like there was a piece that was missing, right? The kids weren't making the progress when she was doing the those like sentence strips or flashcards, or right. And for our Gestalt learners, what happens is kids get stuck. So there's a lot of like, I want whatever. And so they'll say, oh, the kid is so great with, making requests, or like PEX systems, the picture exchange system, which is all really nouns. It's not a robust enough system. And so for a non-speaking learner, like how can we tell if they're a Gestalt processor? You look for those repetitive movements, those playing the same video on their AAC device, or the same script kind of over and over again, them sort of going, one way to sort of notice if a child is a Gestalt processor is if they like have certain play schemes or play sequences that they like to do, and they will kind of repeat it, and they have to finish the sequence before they're able to kind of move on to the next thing. So all of those are tells that this person is a Gestalt processor. And that really informs how we think about their programming, because it's really, really common for autistic learners, for the parents and the teams to say, gosh, they have a really difficult time with transitions. Well, sure, because if they're a hold apart thinker and they're kind of in the earlier stages, and they of like just Gestalt processing, they have to finish that whole before they're able to mitigate and like transition and go somewhere else. As they, just like with the language processing, as they move through the stages of Gestalt processing, then there's, I want to say more fluidity there. But if you are a Gestalt processor, you are a Gestalt processor. Right? Like my daughter, 1000% is a Gestalt processor. Her neuropsych sort of named it during her evaluation when she was 8.5, but the report was 48 pages, and it was so much information coming at me that like it sort of went in one ear and out the other. And it wasn't until probably 2 years ago when I really started connecting with speech language pathologists that specialize in this. So Alex, there's somebody named Katya Piscatelli who's here. She's in Sacramento. Where it was like every light bulb in the world was going off, like, well, duh. But she just happened to move through those stages relatively seamlessly, so she didn't get stuck in the earlier stages. But for learners that do a ton of scripting and, or they repeat the question back or whatever, like, and that's kind of a separate thing, but there's just a different way of communicating, and the best capture is through kind of watching their play, watching for that sort of repetitive play scheme, pressing of the same video kind of thing, and capturing a language sample if they are speaking.
Thank you. We have actually a question from Judith Kennedy. If you want to unmute and please ask your question.
Hi, so this is Jeff Kennedy, Judy's husband. But the question I have deals with a problem that I know Lisa and her husband have experienced with their daughter, and we are experiencing with our granddaughter. And the problem is this: it seems like it's inconceivable. It's like something out of a Kafka novel. All of what Lisa's been talking about presumes that the IEP specialists are A, competent, and B, actually listen to your input. And it actually happens that some of them are not competent, and they don't always listen to your input. And I can give you specifics with regard to our granddaughter, who has a rare genetic disorder, causes hypotonia, delayed speech development, delayed motor development, and seizures. The seizures is the big thing. The others have been pretty much addressed. But how you intervene with the learner, that is how disruptive or non-disruptive you are when you pull the learner out of a classroom situation, for example, can trigger seizures. Right. And we have said repeatedly, don't have your personal professional schedule determine when you intervene with the student, the learner. Have the student schedule determine when you intervene.
Right.
And anyway, Lisa can take it from there, I'm sure.
Yeah, no, I mean, it is painfully frustrating to not feel like you're being heard. Absolutely.
Right.
And I'm not caught up on the latest of what's going on, but yes, you are right. I can appreciate that frustration of feeling like you're not being heard. I tend to enter that conversation actually through inquiry. So I tend to start with, well, what does pullout look like? How is she responding? And if they're saying, oh, it's triggering a seizure, or, oh, there's huge resistance, or, oh, we go in and, sometimes it's better than it reads on paper. Oh, when we go in, if she's super engaged with something, we just
Leave her alone.
Yeah, we just sort of sit back, or whatever, right? So I always try to we talk about assigning competence to our learners. I do try, and it is hard with our painful history, as you well know,
Okay.
to presume competence sometimes and not trust, but I think it's really important. I like to ask, what does it look like? And I'm often pleasantly surprised. But in those moments when I'm not, in those moments when like what I thought was going on is actually going on, it gives the opportunity to say, you know what? I'm concerned about that. And so we'd like to brainstorm what this could look like differently, because we're talking about her health and wellness, and we need to have an understanding of who she is, and that kind of disruption is really compromising her safety and her health and
Yeah.
well-being.
Well, we've done that. That's the thing.
I know. I
Multiple
attend
times.
all the IEP meetings, and the
Yeah,
woman who's in charge of everything, I can't tolerate her. And after being in education for over 40 years,
right.
and sitting in IEP meetings, many of them for students I've had over the years, it's just frustrating. And it's like, okay, this is it or nothing. And so because of her recent seizure history, she has not been in school.
Mm.
And so and it's frustrating to us that the school keeps pushing her to the next grade level when she's not meeting any kind of competency. And yet in the school district where she is, there's not a lot of options she's already in 7th grade. And so it's really because with she has to be provided with something.
Right.
She has to have some fair.
Yeah. I think what I would do is if you are making requests, and it could be for retention, I'm not sure if that's a request, or for different services, or whatever it may be, and you're just kind of being met with this resistance of like, it's fine, we've got it, this is what we do, whatever, I would generate a timeline with some detail. It doesn't have to be a massive document, but a document
Right.
with a timeline and a request for a prior written notice justifying why they're kind of denying whatever your request is. So I actually think I'm going to backtrack on myself. I think I would start with like a formal written request for whatever it is that you are asking for. And in that, I would include language that says, we expect, we look forward to your written response within 15 days. And that should trigger somebody at the district office like, uh-oh, the Kennedys like now mean business. And they should be providing a prior written notice where they have to explain to you using data, not opinion, why they're refusing an action. So it's kind of the similar advice of the request of the initial eligibility, but this is true at any step of the way in the process. If you are making a formal request, whether that's for a new evaluation, for a particular service, whatever it may be, you put that formal request in there with your rationale and reasons as to why you're making the request, and you follow it with a sentence that says, we look forward to your written response within 15 days. And somebody should have a light bulb go on that, like, oh, they've heard the word prior written notice and they kind of know what they're talking about now. It's different than going into a meeting and like spinning wheels and feeling like you're kind of getting nowhere.
Yeah.
And when you send that in, especially since you seem like you're kind of at that frustration point with the team, that things within the team are not forward progressing, CC the director of special education and potentially the superintendent. Like, go a little bit up the ladder to say, hey, we can't just keep rinse repeating the same conversation, because it's hurting our
Right.
learners.
So the director of special education, is that a
Hi, I
position?
just want to interject. I don't mean to be rude, but I just want to, if we can take this conversation, if you can have a
Sure.
conversation offline to continue it, so we can just continue with our questions.
Yeah,
We have
absolutely.
another person, Joseph Mannequin. If you can unmute and ask your question.
Well, my question is, this director of special
this is,
education.
you raised your hand twice. Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, so Lisa, any ideas for pushing the IEP team towards as much gen ed inclusion as possible for an early stage non-speaking elementary school grad student or age student, and supporting that in an underfunded district which is not doesn't have such a great history of inclusion for ESN, so mod to severe learners?
Yeah, it's tough. It's really tough. And to me, if we've got a learner that is in the earlier stages of language acquisition, then having access to a lot of robust communication is really important to their language development, because that being exposed to all kinds of language modeling is how Gestalt language processors learn language. And so if we have a minimally speaking, non-speaking, or earlier stage language acquisition learner, those peer models are really, really important. And so to kind of segregate that learner out and put them in a cohort with learners that are sort of similarly situated in terms of their language development, they're not going to get that robust modeling of all those scripts and gestalts and language used in all these different ways. So that's one thing to really lift up. And the other thing is to name the shortcomings within the standardized testing, right? Like, if you really feel like your child is, should be able to access the gen ed curriculum and be meaningfully included with their gen ed peers, just looking at test scores and making this, sort of sweeping judgment really isn't appropriate. And this is where observation really does come in helpful, because if you have gone into the gen ed classroom, then you can sort of point out the specifics of that particular classroom that you think would really support your learners' development. But it's a tricky conversation for sure.
I'm sure. So our next question is, what do you recommend if the IEP being held for your child is coming from a more deficit lens? So in this situation, my child has an ASD, ID, apraxia, and speech, and has been painted as the highest needs kid in the district. We are struggling, especially in the transition to high school.
Yeah, it's really, really, really hard. And so I think that parent input is really helpful. The other thing is to essentially review the IEP itself and look at how they are framing your learner and reframe it for them. So that can be a reframe of the goals. It could be a reframe of the present levels. I really want you to take my class because I talk about this so extensively, but and I'm recognizing the limitations of our time, but you know, your child isn't deficient, right? They've got differences that impact their life for sure. And they are definitely misunderstood. But no parent should be hearing, wow, you've got the highest support needs kids in the district, right? Like that's cruddy. Nobody wants to hear that. And that's a terrible frame for your learner. They are a whole person. So as best you can, reframe that for them. I have sat in IEP meetings with very similar learners where I have had parents tell the team, like, you're essentially criminalizing my child. Like I had a kid back east where the school team was literally putting on crash pads, and they would be like covered in crash pads from head to toe whenever this child was at school, because the child was an externalizer. And understandably, the mom, like, it made her physically ill, which wasn't my child, and it was making me physically ill. And she was really darling in this meeting because she was trying to be collaborative, and it was like, at some point it was like, I just got to say what I got to say. And she unmuted and just kind of put it all out there, and then muted, turned off the camera, and immediately texted me like, sorry, it jumped out. And I said to her, I think it was fantastic. And it shifted the tone in the meeting because they got it. Sometimes that's really important to hear a reflection back of like, this is how you're making my child, like, this is the picture you're painting. It's not humanizing my kid, and they are a full human being. And we need to be thinking about this differently, because when we think about things through this really deficits focused lens, a couple of really not good things happen, right? One, we either criminalize the child, we don't presume competence, we use strategies that don't actually support this learner, we focus on fixing them, or we think, oh, it's not fixable. Like whatever it is, it just goes to like, all roads go to bad places when that's the frame. And so as best you can, try to shift that frame. And if that is kind of providing a reflection of like, this is how your reports read, and this is how I'm reframing it, I think that's important to share with teams. And it can be uncomfortable, right? Like collaboration doesn't mean that you don't ask the uncomfortable question or say the uncomfortable thing. It's not a personal attack, but your job is to amplify your child's voice. And sometimes that makes people uncomfortable.
Okay, so another question. Our second grader can barely read, but meets the goal set. However, the reading level for him is not at the pace of his community of second graders. I feel that the goals are set on a lower bar, like a state level or something else, yet in Piedmont, kids are so advanced. How can we change the goal to meet the reality of his community of peers? This is helpful for him to integrate and mainstream.
Yeah, great question. So goals are written as SMART goals. So specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, timely. Like, did I hit all the acronyms? And so we're looking at that baseline data, like where is this learner in this moment, and what is sort of reasonable to attain within a year's time frame. And so we do need to recognize the community that you live in, right? And so what is a reasonable goal for your learner? There's no one set right way or set benchmark for a goal or for a learner. And so we need to be taking into consideration, you know, their learning environment, those meaningful opportunities for inclusion. We need to be taking into consideration how they're interpreting themselves in this environment. We need to be, you know, providing tools and building skills. And especially for a second grader, like they're still really young. And so we need to acknowledge that difference and provide that support. And it doesn't have to be like, oh, this one thing. And if you don't think that the goal is appropriately set, either it's the bar is too low or the bar is not achievable, you get to say, I'm struggling with goal 3 on reading. I just don't think it matches where my learner is. I don't think that present level is captured accurately. And you can have it changed. But I think naming the landscape and where those meaningful opportunities exist within this community is valid.
Why would or wouldn't it make sense to list eligibility for ER/MHS counseling under ED, which is so stigmatizing, versus other health conditions? If a student has a DSM-V diagnosis of, say, an anxiety disorder or basic mood disorder, wouldn't it make more sense to put it as other health instead of emotionally disturbed? School personnel seem to insist that the mental health counseling can be provided only if eligibility is emotional disturbance, not other health. But we've been told by outside advocates that that is a requirement, which is not true. Would you clarify and suggest ways to advocate for a child? So it would be really helpful for the audience who doesn't know what these
all the acronyms are. Yeah, a lot of acronyms in the question. So
Yes.
ERMS is educationally related mental health services. And so it's essentially like that counseling piece for a neurodivergent learner kind of within the IEP. I don't like the emotional disturbance eligibility category. And I feel like it's misused a lot. If your learner is autistic, has sensory processing differences, ADHD, OHI, that other health impairment is the better capture, and anxiety absolutely can fall within it. And so when you hear stuff like this is such a good question. I'm so glad you asked it. When you hear something that makes you kind of do the canine head tilt and scratch your head and go, that doesn't sound right. And everywhere I ask outside of my school, they do the same thing as me and they say, that doesn't sound right. You get to say during the meeting, gosh, that doesn't sound right to me. Could you please show me the policy that describes this? Doesn't have to be rude, doesn't have to be snarky, doesn't have to be like, I'm going to sue you and come after you. It's just like, this doesn't make any sense to me. And it might help me if I could read the policy so I could better understand. And I'm going to tell you right now, there is no such policy. And 99% of the time, there is no such policy. And so then you get and okay, we need to be capturing. And when we look at emotional disturbance, I'm not going to read the law, but to paraphrase, it basically says, if the anxiety, if the kind of mental health piece that we are seeing can be explained by autism, ADHD, sensory, right? Like if we can explain it via other disability, this category isn't appropriate. So there's some contradiction that happens within the IEP process. And obviously I don't know your learner, so I don't know if they are autistic or have ADHD, I don't know. But this statement that you have to have a particular eligibility category to receive a particular service is false.
Excellent. Okay, we're going to ask one last question. With the annual review of the 504, I've noticed the team shares my child has improved. So there are questions of if they are still eligible or need a 504. I personally think my child is doing well because of the accommodations they have. How do you manage the improvement in your child and still ensure they're eligible for accommodations?
So funny you asked this question. I just had a meeting today where this was the discussion. I think it's really important. I had this question come up with my daughter when she was in middle school because of kind of the trauma of elementary school. This was always top of mind for me. And I actually just put out a reel today on Instagram about like when school teams say like, they're doing so great, they've made such improvement, like, yay, they're a shining star. And you're like, put in this god-awful position of having to defend what's wrong when you don't think there's anything wrong with your kid. Being neurodivergent isn't wrong. And you're in this, it's just so ick. And then you feel totally gaslit and totally dismissed and all of the things. It wasn't until she was in middle school where she was at a non-public school and the director was like, Lisa, if it's working, why would we change anything? Right. And so I think lifting up that, yes, my learner is making meaningful progress. They are accessing their education. Thank you so much for everything that you are doing. It is working. Let's continue. And especially with a 504, this should be, I hate to sort of grade 8, saying something's easy or hard, not my favorite framing of how to look at things, but I do think it's an easier conversation with a 504 because it is a general education plan and it is not costing the district anything to sort of maintain a 504 than it is when we are talking about an IEP, because an IEP requires dollars. And so it can take on a different nuance when it's that, but with a 504, like it's literally no skin off your nose. Like, why are we debating this? It's working and my child is making meaningful progress and feeling good about themselves as a learner. Like, let's keep going.
Yeah, excellent. So Lisa, finally, there are audience members who want to get back in touch with you. So if you can throw back your last slide.
Oh, yes. Let
Email
me
and
find the
contact.
share screen.
And if you can also share with us how people can take your class or
Yes.
your community.
Yes.
Again, that
And
would be wonderful.
absolutely. And I'm realizing that, silly enough, Anna and I, when we did this, we forgot to put my website on here, and maybe that would be super helpful. So it is www.lisabaskinwright.com. And so on that website, if you click community, you can join the community. If you click products, everything I offer is listed in the products page. I will tell you that it's still open, and I should probably have Anna press pause on it for now, because I think all my slots are full through October for that free 15-minute consult, which then leads kind of to the one-on-one piece. I don't think there's any spots on my calendar. So that's not a good button to press. But the course, we are gonna, it looks like it's closed right now because when I launched it in September, I did it with office hours and with a free month in the community. And it was at, kind of a higher price point. What I'm going to do is I'm going to sell it sort of continuously for the next couple of months at a lower price point, without those office hours, without that free month in the community. And then my plan, my thought is that in January and in April, I'm going to run it again at the price point that it's been this last month, where you have the office hours with me and you have the free month in the community. And when I was first thinking about this course and wanting to write it, I did a lot of polls in my stories on Instagram, and I had lots of folks that really wanted to be able to do it on their own. And I had lots of folks that were like, oh my God, I need to do it with you. And folks that were like, hey, both, we like it all. And so one thing I will say is in teaching this course in the last month, I'm really thinking about it. I am going to re-record the whole thing with teachers and school-based professionals in mind. And that is going to launch in a couple of months. So it will be something to point teachers and school teams to, as a way for them to kind of think about their practice and how they deliver IEPs. It's just, at this point, living in my brain and not yet living in the real world. But yes, so www.lisabaskinwright.com. And there is a link for my bio on Instagram. But yeah, that course is going to be up. I think our goal is October 15th. It's done. I have my strategic planning meeting next week with Nat and Anna. And so, I mean, it could be at the end of next week. But I will announce it on Instagram for sure. And then the community is just ongoing. And so it's a monthly subscription. It's $45 a month. Whenever you start, that's your month date kind of thing. You can leave at any time. I never want this to be a pressure thing, but it is a way at a lower price point. And I mean, we have office hours tomorrow at 9 a.m. So I had somebody today jumping into my DMs saying like, can you come to my IEP meeting on Tuesday? Gosh, no, I can't. But if you want to come tomorrow morning, I can help you get ready in that group setting for Tuesday's meeting. So it is a way to kind of get started and have access to me and some truly just lovely parents. It's a really nice community.
All right, Lisa, I want to be very respectful of your time, and I just want to give you a big thank you for coming and sharing all your wisdom on this process today. So thank you very much.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much for having me. It was really a pleasure. And if anybody has any follow-up questions, just send me a message on Instagram, and I will be sure to get back to you.
Thank you.
All right. Take care, everybody. Thank you so